There's been a lot of congratulations. When I read research articles, I keep saying, oh, we're so thrilled with the success of this and the success of this intervention and early intervention, and it's so wonderful. And yet when you look at the outcome research, that's not what it says. You know, everybody's patting each other on the back, congratulating each other, but people with ASD are getting the short shrift of that in terms of real world. And again, that research isn't getting passed out either. But you're going to see some of that today. What do we know right now about the quality of life of people with ASD? It has to be a starting point. If you're going to be talking about intervention, that's the end point, isn't it? Why bother doing intervention unless the goal is to provide a quality of life, providing the opportunity for a good job, providing the opportunity for independent living, providing an opportunity to have friends, providing an opportunity to get married or to have a close relationship. Why bother, you know, and to feel fulfilled in this world, to be able to function in this very complex, dynamic, unpredictable world, right? Stress-producing world. If that's not the goal of intervention, then what is? What else should we bother with? So you see, if we're going to be looking at intervention, we're going to be looking at, and we are, we need to be thinking, how is what we're doing here going to be related to that outcome? That's the outcome. That's the evidence we're interested in. Unfortunately, that's not what we see right now clinically. When people talk about evidence-based, remember, they're not talking about outcome. They're talking about whatever evidence they think is right for them. It's arbitrary. We have to change that. We have to advocate for the fact that evidence needs to be evidence that really refers to people, human beings who have ASD, and what matters in their lives, what makes a difference for them, right? We have to see, and it's not that hard to see that. If somebody can get a decent job, that makes a difference. If somebody can live and feel like they can take care of themselves, that makes a difference. If someone has real close relationships, that makes a difference. It's not that hard, and yet we don't look at that, strangely enough. Anyway, so let's look at what do we know right now? And unfortunately, we don't know that much about quality of life. There's not a lot of research going on about what actually happens. There's no research that intervention A affects quality of life. Not any. Tell me that's the weirdest thing you've ever heard. Not one study that anybody's doing saying, if we do this, 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 and this, it will impact the quality of life of somebody. This is the only field, this is the only disorder where that's happening. Imagine doing cancer research and not looking at mortality rates. It's the equivalent. Okay? Doing diabetes research and not looking at retinopathy and not looking at down this road, right? And not looking at other, diabetic coma or other side effects or things that really impact quality of life for people with diabetes. Well, in autism, what we're interested in is being able to live independently, to be able to work productively up to your capacity, to be able to have relationships that are meaningful, right? What else? Do we really care about a score on a certain test? Do we care about 3 more IQ points? Why should we? But yet, I just want to put that as a caveat, there's never been a single study done, even though it's very easy to do, to say this intervention leads to this outcome. So we don't know. There is no evidence-based. That's the first thing you have to understand. When people keep saying they have an evidence-based treatment, the question I want you to ask is, evidence of what? Evidence of what? So in other words, I could develop a cancer treatment, right? And in my cancer treatment, I could prove that if you take my cancer treatment, you're going to have fewer colds over the course of that treatment. But you're going to die anyway. Just as quickly, painfully. Well, you know what? I've now created an evidence-based treatment, right? Right? That's an evidence-based treatment. It's evidence of what I wanted to say was the outcome. That's where we are in the state of autism right now. But until we become more educated, and you people who are, whether you're professionals or parents, or consumers of that research, say, no, wait a minute, evidence has to mean a real quality of life difference in the people, and we can measure that. Until that's insisted upon, things aren't going to change. People are going to still be getting grants and still be getting publications and still talk about evidence as if it is arbitrary. It's whatever I want it to be. Scores on this test, whatever. without any indication that it actually makes anyone's life better. Anyway, that's where we are, and that's probably one of the main reasons why we're having so much difficulty. Oh, this isn't working with this, so I'm going to have to do this manually. Not a big problem. So the first question is, okay, you know, I know we keep talking about we need more services, we need more and more, and I don't agree with the idea of more is better. I think we need to be looking at quality and what works. Not that we shouldn't be spending money, but just throwing money at something, more of it, that doesn't work makes very little sense to me. But anyway, is it improving? Just, you know, and what that means is over the last 20 years or so, if you think about it, and year by year, there's been much more of a focus on providing intervention services and support services for people. Is any of that making a difference? Well, when you read introductions to lots of articles, even research articles, they all start out with, oh, we've made such a great difference. But they don't cite any studies to prove it. They just say it, like it's the truth. Okay, so let's look. So here's the people who have done the research. And this is really shocking when I started to read these lately. This is just one of the few studies that's been done. And this is the conclusion. While it is discouraging that the percentage of adults with ASD with poor outcomes has essentially stayed the same, despite what we've done, over time, there's hope for more optimistic findings. Great. Thanks a lot. There's hope. Well, yeah, there's always hope. But you see, there's no statement here saying, how could this be? How could we be spending more money? You know, compared to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, it's been revolutionary in terms of our emphasis. How could there be no change in outcome? Right? But that, they just assume that. Here's another study. Howland in England, she's done almost, you know, like 90% of the outcome research. She's the one person who consistently wants to look at outcome and what actually happens. Although, from her point, she doesn't look at the way any particular intervention affects outcome. In the last 2 to 3 decades, the prospects for young children have improved markedly. And what she means is the services have improved. Okay? Thus, one might have expected that the rather disappointing findings from the earlier follow-up studies, in other words, the studies done, you know, earlier, 2005, that followed up adults, 2004, 2000, before that, would have improved in recent years. Nevertheless, the mean percentage of people assessed as having good, very good outcome, or as living independently or semi-independently, remains below 20%. That's despite our early intervention, that's despite our services. That's pretty shocking, isn't it? Below 20%. And this isn't not me doctoring the data. I mean, this is the way it is. This is what we know. Okay, so I did a little study before 2010, after 2010. There's not a lot of research, so I have to, you know, pick the ones I've got. And there you go. Before 2010, less than 20% rated as having a good or very good outcome. This is a Lai Lombardo and Simon Baron-Cohen. This is a meta-analysis they did of the earlier studies. And then, of course, you just saw what Howland did. And in a follow-up, they did less than 20%. So no change between the earlier outcome studies and the more recent ones. Between 9 and 12% reported as living independently. Between 0 and 17.4% reported as living independently. Between 5 and 27% reported as regularly employed. The 27% is interesting. It was a study done in Salt Lake City for people who are very involved with the Mormon Church, people with ASD. And I think they had much, and really the authors who have talked about that since, the researchers said, you know, that's maybe part of that is the support of the church to help people find jobs and to remain in the community. A nice little finding, 27% in 2009. And then since then, we have 5 to 20%. Not much change, reported as regularly employed. And then just some other things. Beforehand, we had 79% receiving government disability. We don't know since then. Over 50% reported no significant peer contacts. But we don't see much change. So what we don't see is that our efforts at supplying more intervention in general are really leading to the results we would like them to lead. And it's interesting that funding continues to be delivered without any accountability of that. There's no, if you have a child or you're working in a place that provides early, later intervention, it'd be nice to find out, have you studied the impact of what we're doing on the quality of life of people? And find out. Not on this test score, this IQ score, which are meaningless, but on real measurable things, like what kind of job? How many people get jobs? Do they keep them? How much are they getting paid? Are they living alone? What kind, are they living independently? Are they having social contacts? What kind? All right, so that's one thing. But now let's shift to a slightly different thing, which is what we used to call high-functioning people, which we'll still call with autism, which is a real misnomer. But what it really means is people who have ASD but don't have some severe co-occurring medical condition or neurological condition. In other words, they don't have severe seizure disorders, they don't have an intellectual disability, something that really, to some degree, it becomes a more powerful impediment than the ASD itself. Okay, so most of the research in the last years has been done with people who are high functioning, because if you study something with the entire population, you don't know if what the results you're getting are because of the fact that the person's having severe seizures, or if they're ASD. You have no idea, or if they're intellectually disabled or ASD. So what we think of as more pure cases of ASD. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the Center for Disease Control, they're claiming now, 2004, that only 31% of people being diagnosed with ASD have an intellectual disability. So the people that Hans Asperger originally thought of as autism are really now the majority. We used to think, when I first started out, I was told people with ASD we used to use mentally retarded, the word mentally retarded, they're all mentally retarded. In fact, Gary Mesabov of Teach used to teach that. That's, despite what people say, they all have mental retardation. It's really scary to think that was the way it was. And I started seeing people with ASD back in the 70s, and I was like, they don't look that way to me. I see a full range of people. And I see kids who are just not testable. I don't know what their IQ is. I mean, the IQ score is like maybe 30 or 40, and it's like, might as well throw it out the door, because the point is, well, they don't need that. They were born with enough IQ. We call them high functioning. And they were born with the capability to develop speech. Okay? So they don't need that intervention, right? And they're able to learn discrete skills by themselves. They're able to learn adaptive skills. They can learn all that stuff. Their brains aren't impacted in that way. So we would think, if those things make a difference, we would think they would have a great outcome, right? They would be much better. Because we spend a lot of money on intervention programs trying to teach those things to people, right? Trying to see our outcome is more IQ points and more speech, more vocabulary, right? We think those are outcomes, that they're going to change things. Well, what happens with these people? So if you're already this way, which is, according to CDC, 69% of the people we're seeing now are already have this capability, what happens to you? Well, here's a nice statement. It says, while only people with a childhood IQ of at least 70 to 75 do well in adulthood, even among those with an IQ above this level, outcome can still be very poor. I'm going to tell you why it's an interesting statement. If you take any human being with an IQ below 70, forget about autism for a second, what do you think the odds are of them having full employment and living independently and all those things are? Not very good. Okay, sometimes, but not very good. You need to work really hard, and they're not going to get a great job, right? They may, with support, get some supported work. So forget about ASD, right? That's what we have to be careful about. But here's the point, is, do extra IQ points matter? And the answer is no, once you get up to the point where you might be able to function without autism. And this is, again, Simon Baron Cohen and his associates in England. And their conclusion is, even for individuals without intellectual disability, adult outcome is often unsatisfactory in terms of quality of life and achievement of educational potential. So there's a myth that if we give them language, we give them speech, we give them IQ points, it's going to matter. It's not going to matter. There's no data that says it does. Recent study of the increasing number of children identified with ASD, the fastest growing group, and that's true, those without co-occurring intellectual disability turn high functioning. There is an expectation of positive outcomes. But longitudinal studies indicate they don't. These IQ points and language and the ability to learn, basic skills, it doesn't affect outcome. So here's the summary of studies we've seen, and they're not a lot. Again, there's not much. Strangely enough, the one thing that we should be using for outcome, very little is invested in studying it and getting good measures. And, well, you don't really need great measures. Employment, it's easy to measure. But actually looking at our population, right, so that we have a baseline so that we can see if anything works. Between 4 and 13, these are people now who are called high functioning, right? So they already have language. They have enough language. They have enough IQ points. A lot of them are getting through more educational programs, by the way. And many are even going to higher education because there are more services to support them in educational settings. Problem is, once they get out of those settings, what happens to them? So there are, if you think of those as improvements, there are, but the real issue is what happens in life, right? Between 4 and 13% live independently. 4 and 13%. Between 9, 6, and 13% are regularly employed. 70% overall rate of co-occurring psychiatric disorders. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. They're not born with those they're not born with depression. They're not born with anxiety disorders. That's not true. Some may be, but that's a result of living with ASD because it's so damn hard. 53 to 63% depression. And what's really scary is if you look at the bottom, these are the high functioning people. They're estimated to comprise up to 15% of the total suicidal population in the United States. That's an enormous amount. And the latest study that was done, a very big study of high functioning people, 66% reported suicidal ideation, 35% had planned or attempted suicide. So that's our outcome. See, to me, that's outcome. We need to do better. We need to do a lot better. We can. So, this is the bad news. What I'm saying is, it's not the bad news in terms of this is what we should live with. It's the bad news in terms of we need to stop congratulating ourselves on how wonderful we are. And we need to start doing something differently. Because this is not acceptable to me. This is not acceptable. And are there exceptions? Out in the world, of course. But I'm talking about in general, right? Most young, high-functioning adults report no contacts with friends or social invitations. And what's interesting here is that vocational status didn't change. There's a study that was just recently done, 2014, by Taylor and Malik, and they looked at some people are willing to spend the time to look at these things. The reason that they don't have a lot of data is these studies take a long time, right? Well, over years, who are adults, who are out in who knows where, you got to find them, see what happened to them, and track them down. But it's worth it. Taylor and Malik did a study of high-functioning people, many of whom had completed higher education, and found that they were shocked to find that once they got out into the employment world, year by year, their employment prospects went down. They actually, over a 10-year period, got worse. Right? Or did not improve. All right. So what about children and adolescents? High-functioning children and adolescents. A couple of studies done on that, right? When Biggs and Carter just recently compared high-functioning kids with ASD to just kids with intellectual disability who don't have ASD. And they found that in pretty much every area of quality life, the parents rated the kids with these were actually teenagers, with ASD as worse, having a worse quality of life than people with intellectual disability. Why? That shouldn't have to be. I'm not saying each group should have a higher quality of life, but it shouldn't have to be. Puglisi just did a study that found that over the years, between 4 and 23, there was a gradual decline in adaptive functioning compared to typically developing peers. They actually looked worse compared to their peers year after year. And these are recent studies. Anderson, May, and Lord found that social withdrawal increases with age. So, some of these people may have had early intervention, and then they go out into the real world, even as young as children and adolescents, and the real world starts to hit them even earlier. I'm talking about before adulthood, before that, right? And all the great things we thought we were doing in early intervention don't play out because nobody studies whether early intervention has any lasting effect. And it may not. Again, we don't know, but we don't know. It does not. Again, psychiatric problems that are pretty similar to to the adult population. So we're seeing problems in quality of life that really emerge early. They're not later, and they just continue. Okay. So the question is this: why has it remained so poor? Right? Why is quality of life, despite the resources we're throwing at this problem, and again, you could say there's not enough, that's fine. I'm not arguing whether there is, but it's more than it used to be, a lot more. Why is that not making any difference? Okay, well, we're going to talk about that, and how do we make a difference? The issue. Okay. So despite the fact that in the last 20 years there's been this greater availability of intervention, why do we not see a change? That's what this 2 days is going to be about. Is there any evidence that current evidence-based interventions have made a difference? Well, I see people use that term a lot, evidence-based. But I always ask, is there evidence that your evidence-based treatment makes a difference in someone's life? And the answer is no. There's some statements. This is people who did a huge outcome study. They said the great increase in educational opportunities over the past 30 years has not necessarily resulted in significant improvement in outcome. This is just recently. Moving forward, it will be essential that early child intervention studies, which continue to follow up their participants into adolescent and adulthood, to explore whether the factors may improve developmental trajectories, to what extent, and how. In other words, there's a question, there's a recognition that they just haven't. We don't know if they work. And there's a plea from Patricia Howland is, again, the world's expert in what happens to adults. She is clearly the world's expert. And she's saying right here, we have no idea whether these things work. And she's trying to make a nice plea in a gentle way that we at least start having some accountability here. But this is very recent now, 2014. Another study, Gillian Baird, another world expert in England. A lot of this is coming from England, interestingly enough. I don't know if it's because they have a national health or what. The English have done some very nice research in ASD. We have in the States too, but we have done some nice and not so nice. The English have done more high quality research overall. Whether current interventions change the trajectory of autism outcome in adult life is, of course, unknown. I underline that word, of course, because when I read it, I couldn't believe it. So she's basically saying, here's this world expert saying, well, we all agree that we have no idea if any of this works. Of course we don't know. It's like, what do you mean, of course you don't know? Shouldn't somebody find out? No, of course, she says. Like, la-di-da, of course we don't know. So we've got this cancer treatment. We don't know if anybody's dying, if anybody's living longer or not. Ha-ha. We keep giving it to people, spending billions. We have no idea if it works. Research and interventions, and consequently funders of research, need to take a long-term view of the effect of any changes that might be made as a result of interventions. Good idea, don't you think? Before you give money to people to do something, maybe you should ask them if they have any way of showing that it'll work, or at least testing it along the road. But no. People claim success for their interventions without any indication that what they do changes quality of life. And they proclaim it worldwide, that they're successful. They're evidence, remember, evidence-based. Think about what that means. Evidence. Next time you hear that, ask, evidence of what? Because evidence just means we have collected evidence. Doesn't mean evidence has anything to do with the life of people. And I would have to say, if it doesn't, directly or indirectly, why bother? Why are you even collecting the evidence? What's the point? You're making it up as you go along. You're saying, here are the things I teach people, so therefore, at the end of it, they're going to have more of these things. So I prove my therapy works. Even though the things I'm teaching them have no value in terms of quality of life, the fact that I get more of them is my evidence. Think about that. It's pretty bizarre. I mean, it wouldn't work anywhere else in medicine. It works in autism. Anyway, how can certain treatments claim now to be evidence-based when there is no evidence that they improve the quality of life? What I'm saying is right now, every treatment for autism is on an even keel of no evidence. That's what we have to accept. There is no evidence base. There needs to be. Desperately needs to be. But the evidence needs to be that this impacts quality of life. And again, it's not that people say it's so hard to measure. It's easy to measure. Right? We have psychiatric illness measures. We have employability measures. We have friendship measures. We have independence measures, we have et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and we even have things that predict those things. But those aren't the things that are currently being used right now. We also have data, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow, of when we study the adult population, the high-functioning adult population, what are the factors that impair them the most? We have data now in the last 10 years of that. Being ignored clinically, completely ignored. But we have it. We have study after study after study. But it's not translated. There's such a divide between research and clinical practice that exists in no other illness, no other condition. Here are people who have higher intelligence, IQs, they have speech, they are measured as having adaptive behaviors on the adaptive behavior questionnaires, like the Vineland. Why doesn't that matter? By the way, I don't know if you know the Vineland, but there's adaptation, there's adaptation. There's the ability to adapt to a real-world environment, you know, the changes, the unpredictability, which we call adaptiveness. That's not what's being measured in that questionnaire. That was designed initially for people who have intellectual disability in terms of daily living skills. It's got nothing to do with what we call real-world adaptive thinking, flexibility, you know, being able to adapt to change, even though they use that term. Anyway, why doesn't this make a difference? Well, we're going to talk about that. So let me just sum this part up, and then we'll stop with the bad news, okay? Because to me, it's not bad news, it's just the state of the art, and we have a lot of good news. Okay, the limitations of current treatments are, as I said, the evidence of treatment and goals are arbitrary. People get to decide what success means on their own, whatever they decide, and nobody questions it. And they're not related. What's interesting is that the goals that the treatment studies try to attain aren't related to what the research tells us are the things that most impair people in the real world from having a quality of life. There's no connection between the two. It's really odd. One thing the treatments don't do is they don't address the severe motivational deficits that plague persons with ASD from infancy on. You know, we keep hearing that ASD is somehow skills and skills and skills, but the researchers are telling us, it's not that skills aren't making much difference. Motivation makes a huge difference. Intrinsic motivation, which we'll talk about, makes a huge difference. And if we don't impact that, the skills aren't going to make a difference. They teach static skills. They teach skills that work in some lab or some educational setting, but they aren't going to translate into the real, dynamic, unpredictable, complex, everything happening simultaneous, stress-producing world that people are going to have to live in. And they don't provide a pathway for lifelong development. They're often very time-limited. We take this, we take that person, and then we're done. What's next? Oh, I don't know. This is a lifelong chronic condition. People with ASD need the opportunity to continue to improve and grow, and they need support, not to just get by, but to continue to improve, to continue to get better at things that they're thinking. There's a lot of other issues. I just wanted to emphasize those as we stop. What time is it now? Okay, we can move on. So that's the end of that. And we're not going to go back there, okay? I'm closing that keynote, it's gone. But I want you to keep in mind, because it is the context in which we're working from, because otherwise you might say, well, why bother changing anything? Why do we need drastically different interventions? Why do we need to do We're having so much success with what we're doing. Why change? Well, we're not. And that's the issue. And that's where I'm coming from.